everyone. I'm going to wait a couple of seconds here while Facebook sort of catches up to where I am. And I know for sure that I'm live. There we go. All right. So today we're going to talk about the theology of suffering. I'm going to be using material from a book called Call and Consequences, a womanist reading of Mark. It's written by Dr. Raquel St. Clair. She has since remarried, so her last name now is Lettsome, Lettsome, if you ever want to do a search for her online. She is also a pastor and a preacher, so you can hear her preach, but I'm going to refer to her as St. Clair during this presentation because that was her name when she wrote the book and the name under which she is published. I was very excited when I found this material because she really put into words some things that I had felt and experienced about suffering in the church. I think that often in our churches we have taught that suffering is good, that God brings good out of suffering, and that after all Jesus suffered. But Dr. St. Clair brings some important nuance to that conversation, which I think we really need to think about when we talk about suffering in the church. So again, as I have in other videos, I'm not talking about the theology of suffering in all of its aspects. There's a lot more to it than that, but I'm really narrowing down on a theology of suffering that addresses some of the issues that we have with suffering in the church, or at least as in the church as I have experienced it. Now, Dr. St. Clair starts out by pointing out that as an African-American woman herself, she is aware of how important Jesus is to African-American women, and particularly if we look at the longer history of African-American women, as well as African-American women today. Not only does Jesus reveal God, but Jesus suffered. And therefore, Jesus understands suffering. And so because of that, human beings then who are suffering find comfort in knowing that Jesus is acquainted with suffering. And so they feel less alone that when we suffer, more broadly speaking, many of us as Christians feel less alone when we remember that Jesus suffered and know, therefore, that he understands our suffering. This becomes a problem, though, if we think that all suffering is ordained by God for the sake of others, the same way Jesus's was. If discipleship, if following Jesus means following Jesus into suffering like his, then Christianity is left with no resources to actually help people who suffer. All we can do is enforce the status quo in which African American women in particular suffer in service to the good of other people. Now, when Dr. St. Clair looks at suffering, she's going to distinguish between the kind of suffering that she says comes as a temporary result of life-affirming ministry and the suffering that's simply ongoing. Now, I'm not exactly picking up her terms, but I'm going to call them purposeful suffering, and that is the suffering that she says comes as a result of, that comes temporarily as a result of life-affirming ministry, and just plain suffering. That is simply, that's the ongoing suffering, that's just suffering that comes to us, and it's not in the pursuit of ministry. The other thing she points out is that sometimes when we look at the suffering of Jesus, we don't connect suffering to his life as a whole, and we don't connect it to discipleship. And so she is going to do both of those things for us. So let's look at Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 34, because this is sort of, I think for me, the key pin around which this conversation about suffering can be organized. So I'm going to read it in the NIV. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Now, Dr. St. Clair argues that Peter's problem is not that he doesn't understand the need for suffering, but Peter has seen that Jesus' whole ministry is about giving life. In the Gospel of Mark, before this passage, that's exactly what Jesus has been doing. He's been going around the country ending people's suffering. And honestly, when I think about that and when I read a book like this that brings this to my attention, I really do think that we forget to emphasize how important this part of Jesus's ministry is. In the history, particularly of conservative churches in America, we have historically rejected this idea of social gospel, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of threads of history that have gone into that. But how can we say that alleviating people's suffering isn't important when that's exactly what Jesus did for most of his ministry? Peter knows, additionally, he's seen Jesus walk around taking care and ending people's suffering, and he also knows that Jesus is sent by God. And so he absolutely correctly assumes that God wants suffering to end. In Mark 5, for example, there's the woman with the flow of blood, and she even reaches out and helps herself to healing from Jesus. And Jesus doesn't rebuke her. Jesus actually affirms her and heals her and forgives her her sin. So ending suffering seems like, up until that point in the Gospel of Mark, to be the point of what Jesus is all about. But what Peter doesn't understand is that Jesus' suffering here on the cross is purposeful. It comes exactly as Dr. St. Clair has said earlier, in pursuit of this life-giving ministry. And it's not God that causes the suffering, but rather it's the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. God allows the pain that is inevitable given the resistance to Jesus' ministry that comes, but redeems Jesus' honor then through the resurrection. And that reference to honor is important because Jesus encounters both the rejection by the important people of his day. In other words, he experiences social shame as well as physical pain. He is dishonored by those who have the power in his society to give honor, and he experiences physical pain. And I think that really reframes our desire to be honored in our society and allows us to think about it differently and recognize that that is not likely in our pursuit of ministry. Now, this self-denial then that Jesus talks about to the rest of the crowd in the next verse, the picking up of one's own cross that Jesus calls his disciples to, is not the individualistic denial of our own needs, as in Western culture we tend to interpret it. Rather, it's the denial of our duty to family or to class that would have been the center of someone's identity in the Mediterranean world, and the shame that's going to come when we don't fulfill our loyalty to our family, our class, our culture. That means that the loyalty and the honor that would normally be due to or come from whatever group one belongs to. So in my case, the groups I belong to include being white, being educated, being middle class. All of the loyalty and honor that I would get from that, it gets relativized, it gets knocked down a notch, so that the ultimate loyalty for a disciple is to Jesus and his followers. And the honor is that which comes from God and is only going to be visible at some future time, the way Jesus's was at the resurrection. Now, if you know me, you know that a lot of the work I've done in the past has been with Dr. J. Brian Tucker and his work on social identity theory and some of my own writings on that topic. And this idea of loyalties and group identities, where the groups that we primarily identify with have to be relativized down a notch, but not disintegrated, not erased, so that our primary identity is to the church, to Christ, big C, everybody who is a follower of Christ, right? And then other loyalties come below that. Now, St. Clare's conclusions mean that plain suffering, just the ordinary suffering that has no ultimate purpose, is not an integral part of discipleship and therefore not an integral part of ministry. All suffering that we experience is not carrying our cross. And that means that when we see people suffering, we are called, like Jesus, to alleviate that suffering. But self-denial, for example, denying oneself the honor that we might otherwise be able to pursue, and also pain, these come as a result of resistance to the work of, as she says, life-affirming, God-glorifying, agony-eradicating ministry. Only that can be identified as a cross. And so as we pursue the ministry of God, as we go about ending suffering, we may also experience suffering that comes in resistance to that ministry. And that's the cross that we are called to bear. Now, this book, I think, is extremely helpful in counteracting the model of discipleship that fails to address the suffering of Christians, particularly suffering of marginalized or powerless people. Because sometimes we bring into Christianity this mistaken belief that any and all suffering is evidence of discipleship, and that the call to be a Christian is to bear any and all suffering gladly. But Dr. St. Clare shows us through the Gospel of Mark that what we are called to as Christians is to end the suffering of others as much as we are able to, and accept any social shame that comes, because we know that our honor comes from God. So I think this is a really important element as we think about suffering in the church, to distinguish between suffering that we choose willingly, and it has to be each person in ministry has to evaluate at what point is my suffering something that I can gladly bear because I am on the way to life-affirming ministry for God, and at what point have I passed that barrier? Have I passed my own ability to carry this amount of pain? And maybe there's a call to ministry in a different direction where I can make choices about my own suffering. And I think we need to empower one another to be free to make those choices in our own lives and in our own ministries, rather than just assuming that if you're suffering, that's a good thing. Jesus suffered, and let's suffer and move forward. So let's think about that. Let's look around at the people around us and see if there is suffering that we can end, or at least help with, in others and even in our own lives. Thanks for listening. Next week, we will be talking about forgiveness. See you then.